services shed light on the contributions of nature to our well-being. That's great. That's the theory, but hopefully many of you are wondering, first of all, what is the problem that we're actually trying to solve? And secondly, does this new method bring anything different from what we've had before? What is the added value? I'm going to, in this sequence, discuss each of those questions in turn. So first of all, what is the problem we're trying to solve? That's actually going to depend very much on the context in which you're working. It could be a very immediate local problem about a water quality downstream that's affected by upstream decisions, or it could be a broad country-level decision on how to affect certain activities to certain type of land uses. When I think about ecosystem services in specific and sustainable development in general, I tend to try and boil things down to three types of questions that relate to the problem. The first is a problem of magnitude of our impact. Indeed, many authors have referred to the fact that we are now approaching what's called a full world. That basically means that due to the increase in population size in the last century, combined with the implications and the consequences of our way of living, we are no longer just a small economy in a big environment where you could dilute your problems away. We're now hitting the upper boundaries of our functioning ecosystem on a global scale. In fact, scientists who have looked into this problem, called the planetary boundary problem, suggest that we've already surpassed our usage of some natural resources if we wish to keep some level of homeostasis, a safe operating space for future generations. Those areas where we presumably have already extended our use are in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, the depletion of genetic variation, and the way we've disturbed the nitrogen cycles. Of course, when talking about the impact that our society has, it's important to remember that globally, we've accrued enormous benefit through the depletion of this natural capital, whether it's the petrol and the gas reserves or the land that's been converted from natural land into agriculture. This has been the basis for our species growth over the last century. So part of the problem that we're talking about is also about anticipating future problems and trying to attenuate them. The second dimension that I see in terms of the problem is an ethical one. Each of us benefit from the socioeconomic decisions that have been taken in the present or the recent past. But the question I like to ask is, am I shouldering the negative consequences of these decisions as well, or am I only gaining the benefits? I think this is a relevant question for our society because due to cheap transportation, but also the availability of cheap fossil fuels, we're able to export many of these negative consequences both in space and time. So for example, a lot of the toxic byproducts from industrial processes are sent to developing worlds. Or the fact that we use a lot of greenhouse gases to make our economy run is a way of exporting some of these problems to future generations. The third dimension to this problem is one of distribution of wealth and opportunity. I'm not going to dwell too much on it, but there's a question that a society needs to ask is, how much difference do we want between those that have the greatest opportunities and those that have the fewest, and how much difference is acceptable to live within, and when is there too much disparity so that it becomes unlivable for certain? So that sums up the problem. We have the problem of the magnitude of our impact, the ethics, namely who has the benefits and who's shouldering the drawbacks, and finally one of distribution. So that brings us to the question of what can the ecosystem service approach bring to the table? Well, in the most optimistic view, some people will argue that the ecosystem service method contributes to all of these problems. And in fact, there's a very interesting debate going on about our need to switch from a linear economy based on GDP and based on eternal growth, and switching that model into something that's a much more sophisticated circular model that is based upon a much more nuanced and sophisticated understanding of our relationship to the environment. In the past, people have argued that we've grown basically through brute force and through subsidies, by basically tapping into our natural reserves. As we hit the upper limits of those reserves, we're going to have to switch to a new model that is much more intelligent about understanding these functional links between nature and our well-being. So this is a really interesting debate, and I encourage you to read some of the essays by Bob Costanza or Herman Daly, who are talking about how the ecosystem service method can help contribute this transition from a linear economy to a circular economy. We're talking basically about completely changing the way society works and how many of the notions that are embedded within the ecosystem service method are going to help society become aware of these issues and help us transition. That, however, is an optimistic view of the tool. We're also going to give space in this course to some alternative dissident views, people who think that the ecosystem service method, although well-intentioned, could potentially be co-opted for ulterior motives that may not be beneficial for all. Others also think that this is a neoliberal tool that is trying to solve the problems of neoliberalism and therefore will only be perpetuating the problems. So hopefully, by following this course, we're going to give you the tools to try and assess what you think the benefits and the drawbacks of this method are. You've been convinced that the ecosystem service method is useful for putting to light the contribution of natural capital towards our human well-being. But conducting an assessment takes time. It can be as little as a few hours or it can be several months. And you're obviously going to ask yourself at some point, but when are the best cases for using this type of approach? So in this sequence, we're going to ask, when is the ecosystem approach most useful? And secondly, when is it most likely to succeed? Those are two slightly different questions, and it's important to take each of them in turn. So in my view, this approach works best when we're dealing with an important strategic decision that deals with natural resources. I have seen the best examples when we're applying either a governmental decision or even a private sector decision about a specific project, and we have to weigh the pros and the cons of that project. Indeed, the ecosystem service method allows one to be fairly transparent and objective about what the gains and the losses under each scenario might be. So typically, if you're going to build a dam, it's going to bring some benefits, electricity, to a certain amount of the population, but another segment of the population is going to suffer some of the consequences. And this type of framework allows different actors to come together and weigh the pros and the cons in a common framework. It's interesting because this approach can also be used by the private sector in more of a risk analysis type approach, where they have to identify their potential dependency on the flow of certain ecosystem services, or they have to realize how quickly they may be able to rebound after some catastrophic event. So the approach is most likely to actually be implemented, in theory at least, when it's conducted in a certain way. And we're going to get a little bit more into this in the next sequence, but it's when we have situations where a natural resource is clearly identified, a problem is clearly identified, all the people who are potentially affected by the decision are clearly identified, and the process is led in an iterative, collaborative way. That's the theory, at least. We'll see that in practice it can get a little bit more complicated than that. Let's take a very concrete and common example. Here we have a farmer who's using what's called conventional farming techniques. Namely, he is choosing to use herbicides, pesticides, and fertilizers to boost the production of any given crop, any part of the world. This is a decision that is made based on an economic rationale that you get the most food for the least amount of investment both in terms of time and money to produce that food. What's interesting in this common scenario is that there's a lot of externalities that are not incorporated into the equation. So what's an externality? An externality is any effect, positive or negative, that a third party suffers without having a say of either the price or the decision to implement a certain policy. So in this case, think of the farmer who's applying these herbicides and pesticides. One of the externalities in this equation is the production of greenhouse gas emissions, which currently can be released into the environment for free. Greenhouse gas emissions and fossil fuels are used in high levels to produce a lot of these synthetic chemicals. Another externality is the human cost, especially in terms of human health. The workers that have to apply these chemicals may suffer increases of certain rates of illness and disease. Finally, you may have the nitrogen that's released into the environment and that flows downstream. There have been several examples throughout the world where downstream bays, due to eutrophication, which comes from excess nitrogen released into the environment, has entire fisheries collapse of the regions that are exposed to the excess nitrogen. So here's a group, for example, of stakeholders where you have the downstream fishermen who are affected by upstream logical and legal decisions. So how could the ecosystem service method be applied in this scenario, and by whom? I would argue it could be used by a number of different players. First of all, the farmer himself or herself may ask, okay, I can either continue doing things the way I've always done them, or I can go along an organic certification route. What are the pros and the cons of each of those methods? Perhaps you have a local government who's in charge of the watershed and who's getting complaints from the downstream residents about some of the negative consequences of eutrophication. They may get the different parties together around a table and say, okay, we need jobs, we need income, we need to produce food, but is there perhaps a different compromise that we can strike where you can still produce the food, but by diminishing some of the downstream costs? You might also take the perspective from a local NGO that's concerned about environmental issues. They may be concerned about the effects on wildlife in particular, and they may use the ecosystem service approach to highlight how we are eroding basically the base, the natural resource that feeds all of our well-being over the long run, and seek ways to better protect it. Finally, the private sector might be interested in analyzing the situation through the ecosystem service method. So for example, imagine a large corporation or multinational that's considering buying a stake in a downstream factory that produces or that processes fish. They may wish to understand how upstream activities could potentially threaten their revenue stream. So what's interesting about this case is that the people who are negatively affected by the upstream decisions aren't necessarily around the table when decisions are made about how much herbicide, pesticides, fertilizers can be used. These types of decisions are usually taken in a fairly siloed way, and the immediate concerns are, is it safe in the immediate environment? Are the workers going to be safe when they apply it? And yet we see that in reality, over larger temporal and spatial scales, a lot of other factors and actors are ultimately going to be affected by these decisions. So we're starting to see how these are also complicated to implement in terms of getting people around a table, because the stakeholders, whether it's the future generations, the downstream farmers, or other players, often aren't involved in the initial decision. So how does one conduct one of these ecosystem service assessments in practice? Well, it turns out that a bunch of different organizations have put together manuals, and we've put links to these for you below the video. Most of them are freely available. All of them, however, follow a very similar sequence of events. All of them begin with the idea of scoping, namely, what is the problem, what are the current trends, which, if they continue, as is in a business as usual sequence, what will happen? The second important step is scenario building. Basically, and this probably isn't done enough in practice, where people stop and say, okay, what are the different decisions that we have in front of us? We can go down pathway A, or pathway B, or pathway C. And these are basically going to set the parameters to allow us to estimate the consequences of each of these different pathways. The third step is precisely that. It's modeling the consequences of each of these political decisions. For example, when the UK did their national ecosystem assessment, they contrasted different types of economies from a very neoliberal open market view to a more protectionist and isolationist view. Each of those had very different consequences on different types of ecosystem services, from provisioning, cultural, and regulatory services, but at least they were able to model them out into the future. The fourth decision is regarding which indicators to use to see if one is making progress. How will we know if we're moving in the right direction? Fifthly, how does one conduct the valuing? This is actually a very interesting and important step where we decide how are we going to conduct arbitration. Inevitably, there's going to be trade-offs between these different scenarios. How do we decide what is acceptable to our society and what isn't? Are there, for example, some elements that are irreplaceable? Can other elements, if once lost, can be compensated or mitigated elsewhere? These are the types of decisions that will have to be taken ideally in a collective setting. Finally, there's the debate and decision-making phase. It's also important to understand that the ecosystem service approach is not some mathematical formula that spits out the perfect silver bullet answer. All it does, it puts down on paper, white on black, what the consequences of different types of political choices probably will be. Ultimately, it still remains a political decision where people have to barter and trade and find something that's acceptable to all parties. Ideally, this type of process is also done iteratively, which means that as new information is gained or new information comes in, we revisit some of our assumptions. And it's also done in a participatory way where ideas and scenarios are co-generated so that learning is also done collectively. This all sounds, to me, extremely idealistic, and I almost want to start chanting Kumbaya sometimes. But I think it's interesting to understand that the notions embedded within this approach match those of the ideals they're trying to reach. If we are trying to move society towards a more sustainable and ethical way of living, these types of approaches could at least not only help change our minds, but also make us make better decisions in practice. One of the take-home messages of this sequence is that by using the ecosystem service approach, one will end up taking different decisions from those that are made currently. They'll be different, but they'll also be better in the sense that they'll probably lead to a more sustainable society, a more ethical society, where the differences between the haves and the have-nots are reduced. So perhaps we'll start paradoxically by talking about one of the best studies that was done using the ecosystem service method. This was a study done in 2011 where the United Kingdom conducted a nationwide ecosystem assessment. In my view, it was really a beautiful piece of work. It's all freely available online in the links below. And they did everything right according to theory, including the development of scenarios where they projected the different services into the future, and they were able to illustrate how, by pursuing a strictly economic provisioning services, one generated less overall well-being than alternative worldviews or economic developments that put a greater emphasis on preserving and conserving all ecosystem services. Interestingly, 3 years later, there was what they called a follow-on survey, where they basically took stock of the progress that had been made since the initial study. And at least when I read it, between the lines, I was able to infer that not much had changed, neither in terms of policy, nor in terms of real changes on the ground. So why is that? Maybe this is one way in which one can start talking about the different shortcomings of the method. And I'll quickly say that these are my leading hypotheses. They're not mutually exclusive, and other experts or you yourself may have different opinions. So I would start by a hypothesis of basically called inertia, namely, maybe the method is great and it will be implemented eventually, but because our different socio-political institutions have a lot of inertia built into them, it just takes time for those results to come through. Perhaps in 15 years, we'll have a lot of these ideas that are turning into practical changes. A second one is there may be resistance to implementing some of these ideas because there's a lack of legitimacy in those who produce the study. Indeed, often in the past, these were done by small groups of scientists, and we know today that if one wants to have a greater acceptance of the ideas, that even the instigation of the project, let alone the development of the scenarios and the calculations and the different recommendations, should be done collectively in what's called co-production and a co-learning scenario. Thirdly, the approach does aim at improving sustainability and ethics for future generations. And therefore, the work paradigm is also based on cooperation and constructive sharing of information. We know that this doesn't necessarily match the reality where you can have special interest groups who are defending their turf, but you can also have phenomena such as corruption that try and bypass any decision, even if it aims at helping the greater good. So currently, the ecosystem services assessment doesn't have any real mechanism for countering some of these entrenched positions. Fourthly, there sometimes is a mismatch in scale between where services are produced and where the beneficiaries or the consumers of those services reside. To use one common example that you'll see in any study, as soon as one talks about trees or forests, there usually is a line that tries to describe, quantify, and perhaps even monetize the value of the carbon that's sequestrated, and therefore that doesn't accentuate future climate change. The people who are in charge of planting, maintaining those trees are a subset of the global citizens. And of course, as a political decider, I may not wish to spend the extra resources on an action that's going to help the global good, unless I'm somehow convinced that everyone's going to do this at the same time together. So finally, perhaps the method is still, even though it's presented as fairly straightforward, it's just reliant on a scientific knowledge that is still too complicated. We're going to talk later about the difficulty in implementing and mainstreaming these ideas, but even on the scientific side, everyone can understand intuitively that there's a link between biodiversity, and that's the foundation for all the different services that ultimately feed into our well-being, but the exact functional links are still sometimes so tenuous that it can be difficult to convince somebody, whether it's a politician or another fellow citizen, that it's worthwhile protecting this butterfly or this cohort of plants. In addition to sort of the mechanistic complexity, we have, as soon as you enter into the worlds of valuation and monetization, huge uncertainties that are based on some decisions that have to be made. How much is biodiversity worth intrinsically? Values can go from $0 for some people to an infinite amount for others. How much is a ton of carbon that's been sequestrated worth? Again, commonly used values can go from $20 per metric ton per year to $200 per year. And this will have an enormous impact on your evaluation phase of a project, which, given that they're based on uncertainties that have no clear answer, people may say, well, how does this help us in the end, given that the uncertainties around each scenario become so large? So clearly, there still are a lot of things that need to be worked out in this ecosystem service assessment. And we've provided you with a few non-exclusive hypotheses of things that are either shortcomings or that could be improved. We'd be curious if you have other ideas of shortcomings, so please join the forums and share succinctly what you think is a shortcoming of the system. In the next sequence, we're going to talk about the ecosystem service assessment in a broader context. What is the link between this approach and biodiversity protection and sustainable development? So here we are at the Botanical Gardens of Geneva, a place that harbors a large amount of biodiversity. And in this sequence, we're going to talk specifically about the links between biodiversity, ecosystem services, and sustainable development. I'm guessing that a fair number of you, like me, have a certain interest in protection of biodiversity, and so I think it's interesting to think about what the consequences and the ramifications are of adopting the ecosystem service framework for the protection of biodiversity. And that's what we're going to do in a first step. So the field of ecosystem services is really the coalescence or the partial coalescence of three closely related fields. We have conservation biology, the protection of biodiversity. We have the development, sort of the poverty alleviation crowd, and we have ecological economics, people who are valuing and monetizing different types of externalities. And it's been interesting to see how these three fields have come together to create this, what I would call a new field of ecosystem services, including its own vocabulary, its own methods, and its own frames of reference. So in my view, this is a real transdisciplinary phenomenon. I came to the field of ecosystem services through conservation biology. I was living in the United States in the late 1990s and the year 2000s, and I came into contact with a gentleman named Peter Kariva, who at the time was the head scientist of one of the largest conservation NGOs, the Nature Conservancy. I like and admire Peter, called PK usually, because he has a knack for getting to the heart of an issue. And at the time, he and some of his colleagues were trying to take stock of what the field of conservation biology had achieved since its inception. And he was a little bit disappointed. He felt like the approaches that had been used and advocated on, with an emphasis on rare species, on protected areas, hadn't gone as far as he wished they had, or he hoped they had. And so, along with others, including Gretchen Daly and Harold Mooney and other people we're going to hear about in this course, they advocated taking a more anthropocentric approach, putting the human back at the center of the equation. The reason they wanted to do this is they realized that the people who were interested in conservation biology tended to be white, elderly, wealthy, and interested in birds, usually from North America or Europe. And there was a real attempt to try and broaden the tent and make nature more relevant for anyone, wealthy or poor, white or any other race, from a developed or developing country. And that's when they decided to start making the case for the protection of biodiversity as a means for servicing human well-being. In parallel, we have the development crowd that's also making great strides. For example, at the Rio +20 meeting, a document was produced called The Future We Want, which set out a number of development goals, alleviating poverty, guaranteeing access to energy and water, and a secure environment for all. This report produced a series of goals called the Millennium Development Goals, or the MDGs. Of course, there are people who are going back and forth between the conservation and the sustainable movement, and there were a number of people, again including Gretchen Daly, who were writing some papers already back in the late 90s about the links between conservation biology and sustainable development. What has been interesting is, following the MDGs, as you probably have heard already, is the development of the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, which are a little bit broader and which have sought to include environmental aspects as well. As these have picked up speed, all of a sudden we find that the conservation biology movement, through the ecosystem service approach, is being sucked up into this movement and also contributing in validating a lot of the theories and the ideas that are going into the SDGs. So where does that leave us? I find it an interesting question with respect to conservation biology and some of the questions we asked in the opening round table. What are the consequences for conservation biology? Are we still going to be thinking about rare species, genetic diversity, or are we going to shift, perhaps too much so, as we start to focus on bundles of species that provide specific services? Are we going to lose something in the process? So my interpretation is that the ecosystem services field originated in the biodiversity camp, but it is increasingly allowing for and nourishing the sustainable development thoughts. And I wouldn't be surprised if, in a little bit of time, if it's incorporated into the implementation of the SDGs, we'll find that this tool is going to be a really useful catalyst for people of these three different fields in environmental economics, biodiversity protection, and development, a way to bring these three fields together and nourish the SDGs. But it does raise the question, well, what about traditional conservation biology? Are we still going to have space to protect many species, rare species, and especially those that don't feed directly into an ecosystem service? Have we, in adopting the ecosystem service approach, lost some of our leveraging power or the ability to argue for this broader protection? If so, is it an acceptable compromise? Coming from Switzerland, I'm used to these types of really good political compromise decisions where everyone gives a little bit, but I think the conservation biologists have to ask themselves whether they're at peace with changing the focus of the types of nature that we seek to protect. But that's again one of the outstanding questions that are going to go throughout this course, and I'd like you to reflect upon, is think about what we used to conserve and how the ecosystem service approach might change the types of nature that we will seek to protect in the future. So let's say that you decided for professional or academic reasons that you wish to embark along an ecosystem service assessment. Now is perhaps a good time to take a little bit more care in defining some of the terms that we've been tossing around, like natural capital, services, benefits, and values. Indeed, it's important to make sure there's no misunderstandings, especially in an area like this where we have several fields that have come together and sometimes terms are used differently depending on the people's background. So let's start with the difference between natural capital and ecosystem services. Natural capital is basically the stock of all of the parts of nature that contribute to our well-being. You'll see that an important, almost philosophical decision that has to be made is, what do we do about important abiotic elements like water that clearly are important for biodiversity and for energy production? Usually you'll see the decision has been made to include this as part of our natural capital. Conversely, there's also the decision, what do you do about petroleum and fossil fuel reserves, which obviously have a biological origin, but were produced so long ago and take so long to replenish that in most cases this is viewed as something that's not part of the sustainable future we want to move towards, and therefore they're not considered part of the natural capital. I like the image of natural capital and the interest rate that it produces in terms of services, although you'll see in the next module that Juliet Fall is going to also make us aware of how the choice of terms have certain biases as well. But for the moment, let's stick with them and think about how it's a useful imagery, because indeed over the last century a lot of our well-being probably has come from not just the interest rates and the services that come from natural capital, but also depleting this natural capital to a certain extent, such that the day we end up deciding that we can no longer deplete our reserves, we'll have less of an interest rate to leave for future generations. So to illustrate the link between natural capital and the ecosystem services and human well-being, I'm going to introduce something called the cascade model. It's called the cascade model because it indeed tries to illustrate this flow from nature to human well-being. It's worthwhile spending a little bit of time on this conceptual figure because it will be useful to highlight some of the key potential misunderstandings. So let's start on one side of the graph where we have basically what's called the supporting services, or nature. This is where we have the wetland, this is where we have the individual species, and we're going to focus on those elements of the natural capital that are going to produce functions that will then translate into ecosystem services. So first of all, notice that there's a potential ambiguity in the word functions. An ecologist, when he talks about a function, it's something that a species does. This is not the same sense that it's being used here. Here it's the part of the natural capital that will ultimately translate into a final ecosystem service. So for example, when you have a wetland that purifies water, those aspects of biodiversity that do that purification, that is part of the elements or the function that will provide the service. So a final ecosystem service is the part of the environment which, when combined with social capital, and social capital is basically the human intellect plus the built environment, together, when they coincide in time and space, produce an incremental change in human well-being. So what's interesting to note here is that alone, nature will still have its intrinsic value, but it has a lesser value when viewed through the ecosystem service lens. We used to think of the great wildlands where there's no humans as being the things that were important for biodiversity, and here we need to have the overlapping interests of the human activities and the human needs and nature or natural capital to produce a service that has some benefit, which then can be valued either through the expression of a preference or even monetization. What's also interesting to note is that the link between biodiversity and services is not linear, and there's not a one-to-one relationship. Indeed, sometimes a given biodiversity element can feed into different services. Think, for example, again of the wetland example, where it can Both contribute to the water purification service, but it can also provide or also feed into a provisioning service like the fish that are within the wetland. Conversely, you can think of how some final ecosystem services depend on a whole host of different biodiversity elements, and they have to be bundled in order for that service to be provided. So for example, think of a recreational service. If I want to go to a park to relax, I tend to go to places which are both beautiful, that have a stream and a wetland and a beautiful backdrop, some fish that I can fish for, but not too many mosquitoes so that I'm not bothered. And so it's this collection of biodiversity elements that will provide some services. So this raises an obvious question regarding accounting. How do we avoid what's called double counting, where one element of biodiversity is counted multiple times in a valuation scheme? Several working groups have identified this need for a standard set of and complete mutually exclusive list of ecosystem services so everyone can reference back to them and use them in a standardized way. It's a bit like a standard taxonomy for species so that everyone's sure they're talking about the same things. Several such classification systems have been proposed. TEEB has one, the UK National Ecosystem Assessment has one, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment has one. Here, I'm going to talk about the Common International Classification of Ecosystem Services that was produced through a project of the European Union. And the reason why we like it is that both it's fairly complete, but through a website to which I'm going to give a link, there's also a fairly easy correspondence, and you can trace back to all the other classification systems so we have a one-to-one correspondence. All right, so this concludes our introductory video sequences. I hope that we've been able to lay out both the foundations of the field, but also the key questions that are going to follow us throughout this MOOC and that we're going to revisit in our final roundtable. Now we're going to have a couple case studies to illustrate how this method is used. We'll have some interviews with some of our leading thinkers of the field, and finally we'll end up with a quick evaluation.
So welcome. I'm Samuel Vianney, a consultant in sustainable development. And today I'll talk about the true cost of hydroelectric dams. And my main message in the presentation is that it's always important to have the full picture of a situation, of a context when you want to take a decision. So if you look at the first slide that appears on the screen, you will see that a beautiful hydroelectric dam, which provide actually really clean energy for sustainable cities, sustainable consumption, reduce impact on climate change, etc. So all benefits. So it's really important to understand that dams are critical for sustaining growth in a country, having a benefit for the society. And you can see that I highlighted some of the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, on the left of the picture that the dam have a positive impact on. But on the other side, this river, which provide water as an ecosystem services, is also critical for local communities. You can see on the second slide another picture of the same river where communities are using the river to transport goods, but also to fish. And this river is really critical for food security, for reduction of inequalities, for all the biodiversity in the river and on the land. And so those linkages between the river, the community, the production of dams is really important to understand. We talk here about the food, energy, water nexus. So you see on the next slide a complex model that has been built by the Luc Hoffman Institute to model the dynamics that exist on local communities due to the construction of a dam. Actually, so you see the three main areas of food, water, and energy in this model, and you see all small parameters that are all linked together. And it's very important to understand this dynamic if you want to take the best decision in terms of policies, in terms of investment in communities. If we build a dam, we need to make sure that the local communities benefit from it. So this kind of model, if you look at the next slide, helps to understand what is the full benefit or full cost of building a dam. You can see the food, energy, and water areas, and you can see each time the positive and the negative impact. And by having this full picture, you are able to understand what are the influence of a specific policy, of a specific action on the communities. So here in this slide, we can see one of the output of the model that I just introduced. You can see on the x-axis the time from 2000 to 2040, and on the y-axis the fish stock, which is a very important ecosystem services from the river for supporting the local communities that rely on fish for their food supply. In this graph, you see two curves, one blue, one red. And the red is modeling the fish stock using having a dam built on the river. And you can see that the dam has a negative effect on fish stock. It reduces the amount of fish available. But you can also see that overall the fish stock, whatever the scenario is decreasing. And this is due to an increased natural pressure on the fishes because of also increasing food demand because of the increase of demographic. So even if there is no dam, there will be a decrease of fish stock. But the dam will increase this trend and reduce further the availability of fish stock. And so those linkages are really important to understand. This type of model allows to take better decision. Building a dam will create more jobs. Will increase economic activity, the growth, but at the same time will reduce natural capital and some of the ecosystem services. And understanding those trade-offs is really critical if we want to have a sustainable development.
Watershed services, sometimes called payments for watershed services, source water protection programs, reciprocal agreements for water, water funds, or eco-compensation, aim to address water problems at their source by collecting resources from people downstream who benefit from clean water and directing these resources to upland rural areas to incentivize and sometimes directly fund land management activities that have the potential to ensure clean water flows. NACAP has been working for several years with water funds throughout Latin America. These funds often find themselves faced with an ambitious set of goals to secure clean water, biodiversity, and also to improve livelihoods. But their budgets are often limited, so it's critical to target activities in a way that provides the most cost-effective and equitable solutions. In collaboration with the Nature Conservancy, Water Fund technical staff, and with input from investors and other stakeholders in these funds, NACAP created an open source software tool, RIOS, that is now helping these water funds figure out where to encourage investments in specific activities to achieve the greatest return on investment. RIOS, which is an acronym for Resource Investment Optimization System, combines biophysical, social, and economic data to help users identify the most cost-effective locations for different activities. Watershed services that RIOS can model include erosion control, nitrogen and phosphorus regulation, groundwater recharge, and flood mitigation. The tool also includes the option for users to include information about other goals that they may have for their water fund, including preserving biodiversity and improving livelihoods, for example. First, RIOS takes biophysical information about the condition of the landscape, including things like topography, soils, climate, along with simple representations of demand to evaluate the places on the landscape where activities are likely to have the greatest improvement for the greatest number of people. Secondly, RIOS takes into account stakeholder preferences, legal restrictions, or other logistical reasons why activities may or may not be allowed in certain parts of the landscape. Finally, RIOS uses economic data on the cost of activities and available budgets to develop a portfolio of activities in the places where they'll be most cost effective. And the outcome of this process is a portfolio of where and in what activities a water fund should focus their work. These portfolios are essentially scenarios of land use and management, scenarios that can then be used with other models like INVEST to determine the ecosystem services return on investment. And RIOS also includes a portfolio translator module to help automate the process of going between RIOS outputs and INVEST models in order to evaluate the change in ecosystem services. NatCap collaboratively developed, tested, and improved RIOS by applying it in an iterative process with water funds partners in real-world applications throughout Latin America. RIOS has been subsequently used collaboratively in at least 14 Nature Conservancy water fund projects, as well as a variety of other similar programs in the region. Next, I'll show an example of where RIOS has been used, along with other models, to evaluate a potential water fund and its potential for economic return on investment. The Upper Tana Watershed, just north of Nairobi, Kenya, provides drinking water for 4 million people in the city of Nairobi. In addition, a series of hydropower dams on that river provide the vast majority of energy for Nairobi and also for the country as a whole. Stakeholders in the area were concerned about excessive sediment that's reaching the streams, sediment that's causing a lot of problem downstream. For example, too much erosion in the watershed can then end up with sediment filling up reservoirs like the Masinga Reservoir downstream, which is a major source of hydropower. It's also a problem for the city of Nairobi and their water treatment because they have to spend a lot more money to get excess sediment out of the water. In addition, people are concerned about declining base flows during the summer months. In this study, we chose 3 priority sub-watersheds of the Upper Tana to evaluate for the water fund's activities. The 3 sub-watersheds were Sagana, Maragua, and Tikachanya. And these were identified by a previous modeling study as areas that either contribute a lot of sediment into the Tana River or, in the case of the Tikachanya, were of high importance for water supply for the city of Nairobi. In this study, we used the RIOS model to evaluate the best places for the water fund to do different kinds of activities to address these concerns. Activities such as agroforestry, terracing in croplands, and mitigating excess erosion from dirt roads in order to reduce this excess sediment in the streams and potentially regulate seasonal water flows as well. This work was done in collaboration with a variety of project partners and without whose help it would not have been possible, including the Nature Conservancy and Future Water, who were co-authors on the study, as well as a variety of stakeholders and other businesses and NGOs that had an interest in the water fund and the Upper Tana watershed in general. So the idea in this study was to build a business case for the water fund to say, is there a positive economic return on investment from investing in these kinds of activities in the Upper Tana? And the kinds of questions that we addressed were, 1, where should the water fund invest and in what kinds of activities in order to have maximum cost effectiveness? Secondly, what is the actual quantitative change in watershed services that we can expect from the water fund being implemented in this area? And finally, what do these watershed service improvements mean in terms of cost savings to downstream users, in terms of improved water supply, and also to landowners in terms of how much more agricultural production they could get from implementing best management practices? For our 3 watersheds in the Upper Tana, stakeholders agreed on a distribution of the $10 million budget among the different watersheds. And the final results from the RIOS model can be seen here. Each of the different colors in these maps represents a different activity that the water fund could invest in and where on the landscape it would be most cost effective according to the RIOS model. These results were then integrated into a hydrologic model, SWOT, the Soil and Water Assessment Tool, which was used to evaluate the quantitative change in water flow and sediment that would result from implementing these portfolios of activities. Finally, we evaluated the outcomes and the changes in these ecosystem services using a series of economic analyses in close consultation with local stakeholders in order to evaluate the economic benefits that could result. Based on our economic analysis, we found that the water fund could actually have many positive benefits for different stakeholders and beneficiaries in the Upper Tana area. First of all, we found that improved water flow benefits hydropower. By engaging in the activities of the water fund, a small increase in annual water yield means that there can be greater power production at the Masinga Dam downstream. Secondly, we found that a reduction in sediment in the streams can benefit the Nairobi Water and Sewer Company because they have to spend less money to treat the water to remove all that excess sediment. And finally, we found that by reducing erosion on farms, landholders themselves also benefit because the soil is not lost. They have greater soil productivity and therefore the potential for more agricultural production. And we found that in general, for every $1 invested in the Upper Tana Nairobi Water Fund, stakeholders in the area can expect to get back over $2 in economic benefits. The table here shows each of those benefit streams that we did quantify in monetary terms. And we also found that there's a potential for a lot of other benefits that we weren't able to monetize, but that could result from the fund's implementation in this area. For example, some people in the rural areas still rely on water drawn directly from streams for their drinking water. And it has been shown that there's a link between bacteria concentration in the water and sediment. And so by reducing the excess erosion and sediment in the water, these people could benefit from cleaner water as well. To learn more about the Upper Tana Nairobi Water Fund or the business case study, you can download the report from our website.
So, dear Brad, to start this interview, I would like to suggest that you present yourself and the laboratory that you are leading at the University of Michigan.
Sure. My name is Brad Cardinelli. I'm a professor at the University of Michigan, and I'm mostly a freshwater ecologist. So all of my research focuses on how biodiversity in freshwater, mostly working with algae, invertebrates, and occasionally fish, can provide humanity with goods and services like clean water, pest control, and lately I've even been diverging into the area of biofuels.
In 2012, you co-wrote an article, quite important, Biodiversity and its Impact on Humanity, that was published in Nature. Could you please explain to us, broadly speaking, how the loss of biodiversity is altering the functioning of ecosystems and their ability to provide humanity with goods and services?
Sure. So this was a synthesis paper that brought together a whole bunch of authors who have been working in the field of biodiversity ecosystem services to see if we could agree on what the data all show at the same time. And the take-home message is that as we lose diversity from nature, nature becomes less efficient and it becomes less productive. So imagine we look out here, we're losing species and the hillsides are becoming 20 to 50% less green because they're not taking up as much sunlight, as much nutrients, as much water. They're becoming inefficient, they become leaky, and they become less productive. And that's important because most of the things you care about, such as the production of clean water, purification of air, the ability to control pests or disease, or even produce food in the oceans or in crops, that all depends on how productive, efficient an ecosystem is. So if we lose diversity and it becomes less productive, we lose things we care about as a result.
Okay. And reversely, in fact, in the same paper, you illustrated that the correlation between biodiversity itself and the services that they provide is often quite weak. So is there not a danger that by trying now to promote and protect ecosystem services, we are somehow losing our impact on conservation of biodiversity?
Yeah, that's a good point. So in that paper, we evaluated how biodiversity affects 32 different kinds of goods or services that ecosystems provide to humanity. And we had two messages from that paper. One is that for 14 of those services, there's really good evidence that biodiversity impacts them in the way that we thought, that biodiversity is critically important for providing us with things like food, fisheries in the oceans, for control of invasive species. But the second message of that paper is that the other ecosystem services, somewhere between 50 and 60%, we don't have the data required to say that biodiversity is important to them. And so the worry is that people have been making claims about how biodiversity is so important for this, that, or the other, but we don't have the data to back it up. And so the risk that I see is that we don't want to build a house of cards that falls down later on because it's not based on actual real scientific data.
So yes, we are entering, in fact, the field of the gaps that we have in our science to assess the ecosystem services. We are now at this meeting really exploring these gaps for the IPBES. What, in your opinion, are the main gaps to be filled?
I think there's far more talk about ecosystem services than there are data available right now. I think everybody can identify what the ecosystem services are that we believe are important. I think it's fairly rare that we have good quantification that tell us how biology affects that service. So those are called ecological production functions. There's very few of those that exist where we've actually linked biology to the service. And then we have even less that have taken that service and taken it all the way to human value, whether it's a dollar value or whether it's something to do with human health. And so in my mind, the biggest gap is that we need to do the studies that get the data from the production function to the human well-being function.
Right, and in this world of ecosystem services that has been evolving relatively quickly, especially in the policy arena.
Yes.
Do you have good examples where it was applied successfully that you could share with us?
Yeah, I can share one that's ongoing. I don't think policy has been imposed yet, but it's an example where we're influencing policy. So in the US, not long ago, this was last summer, there was a big bloom of an algal species called microcystis. It's a cyanobacteria that creates a toxin, a neurotoxin that can hurt people, hurt animals. And the city of Toledo had to shut down their entire water supply as a result of this for 3 days. We've been able to show through a method called hedonic pricing that housing prices and the tax base in Toledo dropped substantially as a result of this water crisis. And that's it's an ecosystem service. If we can keep that lake clean and keep that cyanobacteria from blooming, we can provide the city of Toledo, with good quality water. And if we don't have that ecosystem service, housing prices plummet by, in this case, tens of millions of dollars, and the city of Toledo loses their tax base as a result. So the governor of Toledo has been listening to our studies and is beginning to take more seriously the need to improve water quality in Lake Erie as a result.
Okay. And you also recently participated in a podcast organized by the Society of Freshwater Science on ideas making waves, and you mentioned that you are a freshwater expert. So I was wondering what you could say about the advance of assessing freshwater ecosystem services compared to other biomes.
Unfortunately, I think my freshwater colleagues have been behind the curve in thinking about ecosystem services, and particularly thinking about how biodiversity affects ecosystem services. Much of this area of research has been driven by terrestrial ecologists, but freshwater ecologists are quickly catching up, and there are so many services in this world that rely on fresh water. It is going to be one of the biggest bottlenecks to humanity as we grow from 7 to potentially 9 billion people. The ability to provide them with quality and a quantity of fresh water we need to survive is going to be one of our biggest problems. So freshwater ecologists are recognizing that, and they're quickly catching up in this area of ecosystem services as a result.
Okay.
Dear Hal, it's really a pleasure having you here for this interview. We're preparing a MOOC on ecosystem services, and I was told by some friends that you were among the people that have been initiating also this, or be part of this whole idea and concept. So to start this interview, I would like you to kind of summarize your quite extensive and long career in ecology, and maybe that brought you here at Stanford as a professor in biology, and to give maybe some highlights of this successful career.
Well, I did my graduate work at Duke University, and that was the main place where ecology was taught in the United States at the time I was a student. And from there I got my first job at the one place I didn't want to go, Los Angeles. But I went to UCLA for 6 years and started research there in local vegetation, and became interested in comparing California systems with those in other Mediterranean regions like Chile. So I started a project doing a comparison between these, and at that time I was offered a job at Stanford, in which I gladly accepted because I was born in Santa Rosa, very near here. So coming up back to Northern California was a great thing.
Okay. And so looking backward at the work you have done and your role in developing ecology as a science in recent years, do you feel that this field of research, ecology, has grown and evolved fast enough to address now the kind of key societal issues that we are facing in protecting biodiversity, for instance?
Well, that's a very good question. I guess the short answer, in view of how fast the world is changing, probably no field is advancing fast enough to keep up with the changes and be prepared for the future that's coming. So I think that ecology is not keeping up the pace, but I don't think any sector of society is, because the changes are so big and are happening so fast that it's a real challenge for all of us.
Mm-hmm. So I was wondering how you were, as an ecologist, doing the link between the different aspects of biodiversity, genes, species, ecosystems, with the functional diversity that they bring, and at the end, the services that they deliver to the people. Do you see still kind of knowledge gaps in linking these different aspects of biodiversity functions and services?
Well, I guess I have to go back a little bit. Mm-hmm. Is that I first became interested in biological diversity when I was on a committee, a national committee, and someone from the food industry asked me, he says, well, what good are all these species? You know, we have all the species we need. We have chickens and cows, and we have wheat, and we have rice. And so what more do we need? And so I started thinking, well, we ought to be able to answer that question a little better than we've been doing in the past. And so I thought the first thing that we needed to do is how does biological diversity relate to ecosystem functioning? What are the roles of the various species in processing the light that comes in from the sun and cycling the water and mining the nutrients and so forth? So that question had never been asked, really, is what are the relationship between ecosystem functioning and biodiversity? So I was with an international organization at the time, Scientific Committee for Problems of the Environment, and suggested we start a program in that area. So that program was very successful, because I think a lot of people working in biodiversity hadn't been thinking about how this relates to function. So that program went on for a while and came to an end. And then the next phase came. Well, we see the diversity function relationship. How does that relate to ecosystem services? And that came later. And my, I guess, interest in that was sparked by this first phase, but then Walt Reed came up with the idea that maybe we should extend the biodiversity concept and into ecosystem services. And so I became involved in the Millennium ecosystem assessment, where that was developed to a high level of degree and has now become very popular in governments and so forth. It's been a wonderful track, I guess.
Okay, you kind of answered already partly my next question.
Okay.
Knowing that we are apparently, given the number we can gather on biodiversity, species biodiversity, reaching a seventh big extinction of biodiversity, and through apparently this time the destruction and perturbation by human activity, and I was wondering. On which basis should we be worrying about this large extinction? The survey of biodiversity itself, or own survival, or just on ethical ground? We cannot accept losing this biodiversity.
I think, as you probably know, there's a sort of a discussion going on in this area that some people say the ethical concerns should override everything about not destroying any nature that we, and the others say, well, that's a very important, powerful argument for getting people to conserve biodiversity. But there's also another powerful argument that a lot of the biodiversity provides services for society, for your survival. It's the life support system, and so it's important ethically, but it's also important for your own survival and your children's survival.
All right, so that wraps up our first module. What points should we retain from this? In my opinion, there's at least 4 interesting points. The first one is that ecosystem services and its method is much more than a new way to protect biodiversity. You probably have some old-timers in your surrounding who say something akin to, oh, I've been doing ecosystem services for a long time, it just wasn't named that way. Personally, I disagree. I think we are setting the stage for a fundamentally new way of integrating environmental concerns into society and into our economy. It's going to take time, and we're going to have to come up with new languages and new concepts, but I think it has the potential, at least, to be truly revolutionary. The second important point, as have been illustrated in our case studies and in our game, it's important to integrate nature in our decision making. What we've also seen is that it's very complicated to identify the specific ecological functions that will then translate into specific services that specifically translate into human well-being. A lot of these functions are nonlinear, they're multifaceted, and our scientific understanding has a long way to go to clarify some of these relationships. Thirdly, the Cascade model provides a useful heuristic model that can be modified for each specific case and is helpful for bridging, on one hand, the technical people that provide data and analyses, but also the socioeconomic and the governance side that still needs a much better integration. In fact, I think that this course and training people like you is going to be a real asset in having people that can converse between these different worlds. Fourthly, the examples that we've seen illustrate that the field of ecosystem services is exploding with new ideas, new initiatives, new terminology, new methods, new tools, lots of new people coming into the field. What we hope to convey is that you too probably have a place to contribute to this growing field. We hope that you'll join in some of the international initiatives like IPBES or the Ecosystem Service Partnership so that you will also become a player in this growing field. So that completes our Module 1. In our next module, we're going to talk about valuation, which will be led by our Professor Salvatore Di Falco from the University of Geneva. It will also feature some guest appearances from world specialists on valuation like Pavan Sukhdev and Mike Hannes. They will also have a debate between one another on the relative merits of valuation and whether it's worthwhile monetizing some ecosystem services or whether it's potentially dangerous to do so. Don't forget to take the quiz. We'll see you soon.